I would like to solve two riddles with you. The riddles are about depression and suicide. Did you know that depression is one of the leading causes of disability worldwide? And did you know that it mainly affects women? While 1 in 10 men will suffer from a serious depressive disorder at least once in a lifetime, it is as many as 2 in 10 women, twice as many worldwide. This gender gap is one of the big riddles of psychiatry. You all know that depression can lead to suicide. So from what I have just told you, you might now expect that also suicide is much more common in women. But on the contrary, it is mainly men who die from suicide. This paradox gender gap is the second riddle. I've been interested in these two riddles for quite some time now. Why? Well, because I'm convinced that if we could solve them, we could prevent depression and suicide. So let's look into depression first. Why is it that women suffer from this disease twice as often as men? Could it be a false finding? Could it just be that we detect depression more often in women because they seek help more often? Well, there is some evidence pointing in that direction, but it doesn't fully explain the huge difference. There mainly seems to be a true difference. How can you explain it then? Well, depression is quite a complex disorder, which can have biological as well as psychosocial causes. So could it be that women are just more prone to depression because of their biology, their sex hormones, their genetics? So far, there is hardly any evidence for that. Rather on the contrary, the female sex hormones, the main female sex hormones, estrogens, rather seem to protect from depression. So there remain psychosocial causes. And here we seem to be on the right path. In fact, many psychosocial risk factors for depression are much more common in women than in men. For example, sexual abuse, domestic violence, discrimination, you name it. And also certain personality factors. And tonight I want to focus on them. Research on personality traits has shown that women on average differ from men. On average only, of course, there's not the woman and the man. There rather is a high overlap of genders. But on average, women seem to have a lower self-esteem, to be more shameful, less assertive, and less action-oriented. And you know what? All these characteristics are quite well-known risk factors for depression. Gender differences also pop up in cognitive style. Let's say you have a conflict with a colleague. If you're a woman then, you typically think, oh, what have I done wrong? Certainly it's my fault. I always do everything wrong. While if you're a man, you will typically think, not my fault, due to the colleague, the situation, and you move on. Women not only tend to internalize conflicts, they also often ruminate about them. They develop feelings of guilt and thereby depression. Men, in contrast, tend to externalize. They cope more actively with problems, but sometimes also aggressively. And this, if directed towards others, can lead to fights, but if directed towards themselves, the aggression, it can lead to suicide. Why is it that women have these tendencies? Well, here I would like to tell you a personal story. When I was a little child, a schoolgirl, we girls all used to have poetry albums. And let me share a typical poem with you. It says, "Grow up like a violet in the moss, modest, simple, and pure, not like a proud rose which always wants to be honored." This poem, in my view, quite clearly shows how girls were brought up. They primarily had to be modest. Boys were not brought up in that way. You might now say that this is completely different nowadays, but I sometimes doubt it if I look at my students. So many bright young women are still very modest and hardly dare to claim too much for themselves. Some of them, in Switzerland, many of them, even do not dare to pursue their careers when they get children, for the sake of motherhood and family, they say. But I've hardly seen one young man who doesn't dare to pursue his career for the sake of fatherhood and family. This is quite unfortunate, as perpetuating these traditional gender roles might at the same time also perpetuate the risk factors for women, for depression in women, which I mentioned right now. Some confirmation for this hypothesis has recently come from a large WHO study, which showed that the gender gap in depression seems to decrease over generations in those countries where gender role traditionality decreases. But what about men? What about their suicide risk, which is 2 to 4 times higher than that of women in most countries of the world? The main explanation for that is that men do not like to seek help when they suffer from mental problems. They also use more aggressive, and that is more lethal, methods when attempting suicide. And this again could be related to traditional gender roles. Thus, according to the traditional masculinity ideal, a real man is strong and independent. He doesn't show any weaknesses, doesn't need help. And isn't that also due to upbringing, in that case, of little girls, of little boys? Of little boys. Isn't that exactly what we tell them, the little boys? A boy is strong, doesn't cry, doesn't call for help. So what's the conclusion of all that? What message do I want you to take home? Well, in my view, it's quite obvious. If you want the world to be happier, with less depression, less suicide, then have a more critical look at traditional gender roles and try to counteract them wherever and whenever possible. Already, and most importantly, in the upbringing of children. Help women to counteract traditional femininity when it's self-destructive. Start with little girls, strengthen their self-esteem, encourage their active coping, their assertiveness. Read the books of Pippi Longstocking to them. Also help men to counteract their traditional masculinity when it's self-destructive. Encourage little boys to show their feelings, show their weaknesses, call for help. As Gloria Steinem said, we have now begun to raise our girls, our daughters, more like our sons, but few have the courage to raise the sons more like the daughters. Have the courage. Thank you.